lots of respects, but certainly it creates a different type of history. But in doing Violent London, in doing this Republican history of Britain, what I came to find out was the history of people who have been forgotten. You know, you go to graveyards and you say, who the hell's he or who the hell's she? Just a forgotten name, nothing special. You look at a photograph, who the hell are they? And it strikes me that looking at these things, again, returning to what people did because they had, bad or good, because they felt it was heartfelt, because it was felt that's what they needed to do at that time. And certainly we could do with that, maybe a bit of that now. Just struck me as very interesting. We have supposedly nowadays one camera for every 14 people. Well, that's a statistic anyway, and not all of them work, of course, but one camera for every 14 people. We have amazingly draconian laws, the Public Order Act 1986, SOCPA 2005. These are laws that when people were fighting Oliver Cromwell, John Lilburne could actually go and talk to Oliver Cromwell. Now, obviously that's difficult nowadays. The last time the Labour Party went on the stump, actually went out and met anybody, John Prescott ended up in a fight, if you recall. The time before that, or time just recently, Mandelson was caught with a custard pie, wasn't he? The point I'm making here is that the distance is very great now. And so this, in a sense, in a little bit of a sense, records something that's vanished, records something that's not going to return in our political life. And it's a political life that exists on the street. It doesn't exist in Parliament, it exists elsewhere. The moral the moral sense of what's going on here, I think, is interesting. It doesn't always fit the governmental requirements, and that I think is of interest. Nowadays, of course, can you riot anymore? Well, the answer is, of course, yes, you can. But almost certainly, every time anybody does anything, as I said before, you'll have a virtual riot because everybody will get their cameras out. So all rioting now is done to the camera. There's almost none that I can see, apart from maybe in very violent situations in other countries, where rioting in Britain anyway goes on in anything other than a virtual space. And maybe that's where rioting is going to go. Because one of the things you can see, for instance, with the G20 disturbances, with maybe the peace camp that's coming up, is you're not going to get many people on the street. You're just not. There's not going to be millions of people. Also, what's terrible to know is whether you're violent or not violent, it doesn't seem to make any difference. You're more likely to get your way if you're violent, but you're no more possibly than if you're not violent. So the thing becomes a bit futile, and that's it's sort of a history of lost causes. Because an awful lot of these things take 50, 100 years after the poor guy's died for the thing to actually be enacted as law. So you need this pressure. You have to keep this pressure on the whole time. But John Lilburne never saw what he hoped to see, which was liberty of conscience and a type of pseudo-democracy. Tom Paine only saw it in two foreign countries, France and America. So these things change again and again. Anyway, I hope you're interested in what I have to say. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take some questions. Yeah, go on.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I sit down? Sorry.
During the time of John Lilburne, on here, during the time of John Lilburne and Oliver Cromwell, was the word dictator actually used?
Yes. Well, it's interesting. These words are very problematic because the first word, just to change the subject, the first word of terrorism, of course, is determined by the French terror. So terrorists originally were government agents. It was a government policy terrorism, because terrorism brought in democracy in the French Revolution, Robespierre and all that. The word dictator comes from before that, so they would use words like anarchy and dictator, maybe not quite as we understand them. So certainly Lilburne, I don't think he ever said, you're a dictator, I don't know. He would say something like, you are an absolute ruler, or you are, you know. So you'd have to look that up. I don't know, I should do perhaps, but I don't. But certainly these words were banned. Anarchy, for instance, is a 17th century word. And people like Hobbes and Locke are trying to argue against natural anarchy. In other words, they want people to band together for mutual benefit. Dictator is a very interesting word, actually. The Duke of Wellington, who was a right snob and a very wonderful man, but a terrible civil, is a bit like Churchill, great in war, terrible in peacetime, constantly was barricading Apsley House with machine guns and well, not machine guns, but you know what I mean, to fight off the rebels. And I had a letter, and God, you know, never lose anything, I lost the bloody letter, in which he, not a copy of the letter, I have to say, not the letter, in which he actually wrote to a friend, I'm fed up with this, why don't people accept me as dictator of England? He was Prime Minister at that time, but I lost and so I haven't got the evidence anymore. But that idea of being absolute ruler, of course, is his famous line, whether he ever said it with the cabinet. He said, I gave them their orders and they wanted to discuss them. So, you know, Wellington was by that point, the word dictator is absolutely understood by everybody. And the word dictator is used to someone earlier who will bring in republicanism. So you do get the word dictator used, for instance, with ancient Rome. Sorry, it's a long answer, but it's a very complicated one.
Well, I just wondered, I mean, does your book mention the anti-Jewish riots of 1947?
Yes,
London
yes, I've got all that.
Which were just mentioning of, the hanging of the 2 British sergeants in Palestine, which triggered that event.
Well, the interesting thing about those is the fact that before the war, of course, it had been Oswald Mosley, and immediately after the war, anti-Semitism started up again as if it had never gone away.
It was Palestine.
Yeah, but it started up immediately. It was like there was no gap, and of course then it was a man called Geoffrey Ham, interesting, useful name for an anti-Semite, Ham, but it was Geoffrey Ham rather than Oswald Mosley. But Geoffrey Ham, interestingly,
Mosley's lieutenant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But he was his lieutenant. He was a more prominent figure in the 40s. But interestingly, I haven't found, and it is curious, that you think of fascism and anti-fascism, almost nobody dies. In fact, nobody dies at all. And there's almost no injuries, actually, no really violent injuries. Someone takes a pot shot at Geoffrey Ham out the car window and misses, presumably with an old army gun. But it's amazing, you think of Gordon riots, think of these other riots, people dying everywhere, and there's no death. You know, it's violent, but it's that end of that sort of violence where people actually die. Of course, unfortunately nowadays people have died, but it's a rare occurrence.
Quick note from archaeology that might slightly ruin your intro, but I think it's actually more interesting. Boudica.
Oh.
They looked at the actual burnt layer across London that is sort of wonderful for those of us that think those legionaries are crazy. But there weren't bodies. It seems she chased them off.
There are bodies. There are bodies. I've got pictures of them in the book.
It seems she chased most of them off. And a lot of the slaves were set free. And if you actually look at Tacitus in the paragraph exactly after that, I agree he's a liar,
yeah.
But he couldn't lie about the fact that there was such a lot of mutiny that their boss was sent home to Rome afterwards. So a lot of it was basically people kicking off to support the Druids who were under attack in Anglesey. And
my view on the subject,
they all
and it's been supported by
ran away.
archaeologists at the Museum of London for its work, because I gave some of the evidence to them, is that I think from the written evidence, the Iceni, who of course were in Norfolk, who were the people that were under Boudica, were migrating. And I think this part, and it's a very technical argument, but it's partly a problem of migration. Because if you look at the dates and the times and the things they're doing, it's about migration, it's about failed crops. So I think the taxation, which is meant to have kicked off Decianus, and the whipping of Boudica, which might not have happened, it presumably did happen because it's reasonably well recorded, probably were a catalyst, but not necessarily the only catalyst of the movement. But there are 3 skulls. I've got them in the book. I've literally got them in the book. They're not free gifts. But there's at least 3 skulls that they suggest are victims. I don't think there was anywhere near as many people killed. That's just, it's like saying there was 10 million people at Armageddon. It's ridiculous argument. But a large number obviously suffered. There was plenty of time to get out of London. There wasn't plenty of time to get out of Colchester. So presumably, I've got an appendix about that situation. So presumably, anybody with any sense, popped over the river and went across the Gordon.
But Tacitus's father-in-law was the boss of the army, so yes, it's like my father-in-law is married to the head of the Gestapo's version of the British occupation.
But it's interesting, there isn't one Celtic word from 400 years of Roman history, and I think it's interesting to try and, even if Boudica was a horrible woman, I've got no idea of working that out, but just trying to give them some words back, and it's sort of anti-colonial, really, in that sense, and that's the only colonial bit in that strict sense I've got, because of course when the Romans came they colonised.